Okay, number 36, it's a pretty complex trigonometric, well, basically you're verifying that one side is equal to the other here. And I want to quickly talk to you about some things about trig that you may know and you might not. First of all, I want to talk about reciprocal, because in trig we do some reciprocal functions. A reciprocal is, like, we think of it as flipping a fraction, but really what you're doing when you have a reciprocal, well, let me do the easy ones first. You know that the reciprocal of 3/5 is 5/3. The reciprocal of 5/7 is 7/5. 6/19 becomes 19/6. Okay, and here's a trig ratio, adjacent over hypotenuse. If you did the reciprocal, this is what it looks like. Okay, now, algebraically, if you have n for an unknown rational, you can't really flip it necessarily until you realize that, like, for instance, a whole number 6 is really 6/1. And if you flip that, that becomes 1/6. Algebraically, if you have an unknown rational, let's pretend that the 5/3, you're not sure what that is. If you did 1/5/3, that's 1 divided by 5/3, that's equal to 1 times 3/5, or 3/5. So I reciprocaled. 1 over any unknown rational is how you tell something that it is the reciprocal. So you have n over 1 here. That's the same as 1 over n, and that's how we write reciprocals. Now, the reason I say that is this. First of all, we have 3 functions in trig that we use most frequently, and in your calculator that you will have access to, and in fact in most calculators, if you look at the math trig part of it, you will notice it only has sine, cosine, tangent. A sine of these means inverse, and then sine, cosine, tangent. Those are the only ones you have that you can work with. So what I want to show you quickly is how they relate to one another in terms of reciprocals. The sine of x is equal to opposite over hypotenuse, so 3/5. The cosine of x is equal to adjacent over hypotenuse, so 4/5. Now here is something that you just have to know. The tangent of x, by the way, the sine of x and cosine x, they are the building blocks of all trig functions. Every single trig function can be boiled down to nothing but sine of x, cosine of x. Okay, so tangent of x, it actually is equal to, and you know that the answer to that is 3/4. The ratio of the tangent of x is 3/4, but that's not how it's calculated on the unit circle. Okay, because you usually don't have all of the sides. This is how you calculate it. The tangent of x is equal to, memorize this, know it, it's equal to always the sine of x divided by the cosine of x. And just to test that, the sine of x up there is 3/5, correct? And the cosine of x is 4/5. If you did that math, really simple math, 3/5 times 4/5, or sorry, 3/5 divided by 4/5 is equal to 3/5 times 5/4. Okay, those 5s would cancel, and it equals 3/4, which of course you already knew, opposite over adjacent is 3/4. But that's how it's calculated when you have 2 of them and not the third. Now, I'm going to talk to you quickly about the reciprocal functions. Every one of these 3 functions has a reciprocal function. Okay, the reciprocal function of the sine of x is called the cosecant of x. The cosecant of x is equal to 1 over the sine of x. That makes it the sine of x's reciprocal function, and 1 over 3/5 would equal 5/3. Okay. By the way, I want you to notice that the sine of x and the cosecant of x, for some reason I've always wanted to put cosecant of x with cosine of x, but it doesn't go like that. Okay. It is, cosecant is the reciprocal of sine. Cosine has a reciprocal function known as the secant of x, is equal to 1 over the cosine of x. Okay, the reciprocal of the cosine of x, and that would be 5/4. Okay, lastly, the tangent of x has a reciprocal as well, the tangent of x reciprocal is called the cotangent of x. Okay? The cotangent of x is equal to 1 over the tangent of x, which means it's the reciprocal of anything that is tangent. So the cotangent is actually equal to the cosine of x over the sine of x, so the reverse of that, and it's going to be equal to 4/3, the reciprocal of the numeric tangent of x. Okay? Now, I bring all of those up because looking at question number 36, you've got some really ugly, well, it's not ugly, but it's just a lot of cosines and cotangents and so on. And so what you're asked to do is find at one or more errors. All right, so step 1, cotangent squared plus 1 is equal to the cosecant squared. Well, that's got to be given, so we're just going to go ahead and say that's a given. Okay, the next one, it takes the cotangent of x, cotangent squared of x, and gives you sine squared of x over cosine squared of x. Remember, the tangent is the sine squared over the cosine squared. Okay, or tangent squared, I should say, is going to be equal to sine over cosine. So if this is cotangent, this should have said this. It should have said cosine squared of x over sine squared of x plus 1 equals cosecant squared of x. Okay, so because of that, step 1 has an error. But let's move down from there. They took this. They had sine squared plus cosine squared plus 1. I'm sorry, sine squared over cosine squared plus 1. What they did was, okay, there's sort of an unwritten thing that in other words, they sort of skipped a step. But what they did was this. They took sine squared of x over cosine squared of x. And remember that 1 is 1 over 1. Well, they wanted common denominators, so they multiplied by the denominator over there. So they multiplied by cosine squared of x, which gave them sine squared of x plus cosine squared of x over the cosine squared of x. Okay, and that's how they got to that step right there. So they just did common denominators and went ahead and added. Nothing's wrong with that, so that step is fine. From there, they said cosecant squared of x. Remember, cosecant goes with the sine, not the cosine. And so it's the reciprocal of the sine of x. So this should have read 1 over sine squared, not 1 over cosine squared. So that has an error in it because that's the wrong function, the wrong reciprocal function. And then the last step, and this is an important one, sine squared plus cosine squared always equals 1. Okay, and it did that. And then cosine squared on the left, it just came down, so 1 over cosine squared. And then they brought that down, even though it was wrong. There's not another error that occurred. So the errors occur in steps 1 and 3, and that is D. Now I want to tell you that your calculator on this one, to be honest, is almost useless unless you have a lot of patience. Because what you would have to do, and let me just, let me go up here and show you. What you would have to do to verify this, essentially, is you would have to enter this in terms that your calculator understands, and your calculator only understands the sine and the cosine and the tangent. So if it had cotangent squared of x plus 1, what you could do is pick an x value, like you could say x equals 30, okay? And you could go, all right, so in the calculator, cotangent of x, so you would go 1 over the tangent of 30, quantity squared, okay? Which you could write as tangent of 30 to the -2 power. And that would be how you could write the cotangent squared of x plus 1 equals cosecant of x. And you could keep going down and entering 30 in and just check to see in step 1 versus step 2, did I get that? Is the number the same? the result the same on the calculator's face. To me, it's a lot easier just to know the math facts. So make sure you've memorized and you know how sine, cosine, tangent, cosecant, secant, and cotangent relate to one another, and also that sine squared of x plus the cosine squared of x is always equal to 1. Okay, and we're done.